disability and accessibility, ways to make the debate space more accessible, and ways that our community can change in order to accommodate and make accessible rather those who are disabled who want to be in the space. I'd like to introduce and thank some of the folks who made this forum possible. Joshua Gonzalez is not here. Is he not here at all, or is he just not here?
Late.
He's late. Joshua Gonzalez was a huge part of making this get this put together from the University of Houston, as well as Sarah Spring from Houston, as well as Ricardo Sands, who is doing the live stream for us. So we're live streaming over the internet right now.
Starting in 20 seconds.
Starting in 20 seconds. In addition to that, Joel Rawlings, who made this space available to us this evening, and Zach Richter and Chris Hall, who can't be here tonight, but who are debaters who have helped us to put together. Zach's a former debater, Chris is a current debater for Weber State. They helped us put together the agenda tonight, as well as did a lot of the promotion for this event. So we couldn't have made this possible without them. After tonight's, the sort of lecture portion of tonight, we're going to have a Q&A at 8:45. Your schedule says 7:45 because when I put it together, I had different time in mind. I guess time is wibbly wobbly. So it's 8:45, not 7:45. We will have question and answer both from the live stream as well as from those of you in the audience. And I'll make myself available. Luke and Eric, I think, will also make themselves available afterwards for more questions, though I know pairings come out at 9. So we want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to work on their pairings as well. So tonight we're going to talk about disability and accessibility in the debate space. We have 3 presenters, and then we're going to do the Q&A period. We're going to be taking questions via live stream. For those of you joining us on the internet, you can send in your questions via the live stream feed, and we will get to them at 8:45. I'm going to be talking about why accessibility matters in the debate space and some best practices for an accessible debate space. Eric Lanning from Houston is going to be talking about this idea of a debater's philosophy, similar to a judge's philosophy, and ways that we might be able to use that to encourage accessibility in the debate space. And then Luke Floyd from Georgia State is going to be talking about invisible disabilities, both physical and mental disabilities. So what unites our conversations today is that we all want a more accessible debate space. This forum is one small step in a series of small steps that we're all taking as a community to make this goal a reality. 2 weeks ago, I was in Utah at the Weber Round Robin, and a high school debater came and watched a round of mine, and she came up to me afterwards to talk about how she's reading arguments about disability in high school. We want to make sure that the structures of this community are able to welcome her when she comes into the college community. We want to make sure that debaters who are coming out of high school have an opportunity to have an accessible debate space for them. Along the way this year, while Dan and I have been reading these arguments, people have asked us what they can do to make the debate space more accessible. What are the tangible steps? We're going to talk about some of those tangible steps tonight. This forum is an attempt to disseminate some initial information, though it cannot be comprehensive in any way in 1 hour, and to begin a discussion about this that exists not just inside of a debate round, but also within the context of our community. It's important to note that those of us that are speaking tonight can only speak from our own experiences and what we have experienced within the debate space, and that the thoughts that we share today are good ideas, but they're neither complete nor comprehensive. That more ideas need to be generated in order for us to create a more accessible debate space. There's no one single disability and no one single way to make accessibility a reality. It takes community effort of active listening and responding to this community to make more accessibility a reality for us. So we're going to talking about the word accessibility and why that word matters. For those of you who followed on Facebook, you've seen that I've had a very strong critique of the word accommodation. This is a word that is problematic when you're talking about things from the disability perspective or from the perspective of disabled people. That puts the onus on a student or a disabled person to advocate for themselves. Accommodation is something that creates a medicalized model of disability. Those of you that I've talked to about this, you know a little bit about the social and medical model of disability. They're not the only 2 models that we can use to talk about disability, but they are 2 of the prominent ones that exist in the literature base about this. Medical model is not really about medical problems or how often you see a doctor about your different disabilities, but it's about the problematization of disabled people as opposed to the problematization of societies that disable or structures that disable. So it's not about whether or not people can bring their service dog into anywhere. It's about whether or not society creates structures that disable. So when we talk about that, we talk about accommodation being a reinforcement of the medical model. It reinforces the problem of a disabled person rather than the problems of a structure, a society that's structured to the exclusion of disabled bodies. When we talk about that, it shifts blame. It singles out those who must have to then advocate for themselves, must have to say, well, I need more space in this community. I need different space in this community, as opposed to creating an accessible community to begin with. So when we talk about accessibility, it reinforces the social model. It reinforces that there are structures in society that disable, as opposed to the disability of a person being the problem. So that is an attempt to address structural burdens as opposed to addressing the problem of a person. That makes sense to everyone? Yeah, nods, good, nods are good. Feel free to use your nonverbal communication to let me know that I'm communicating properly to you. So let's talk about some standards for accessibility. We're going to talk about 3 standards tonight. Obviously not the only 3 standards, but I think they're really important. The first is freedom of movement. The second is a sense of inclusion. And the third is equitable participation. I'm going to start with freedom of movement. Autonomy is really the critical component here, right? Can wheelchairs get into your squad room? Can they get through your squad room? Is there a 3-foot wide space that allows wheelchairs to get through the door, to get down an aisleway? When you're in a room over the weekend and you're messing up all the desks in order to build yourself a little table to build on, is there still ways to move around that room? Or are the desks blocking the way, right? That's a real practical example for us. Is your squad room accessible by an elevator? Is the debate room accessible by an elevator? We were on the Cal campus a few weeks ago. We had a really great debate with Cal about accessibility where we talked about the ADA problems on the Cal campus. There's a bathroom, but it's a floor down and a floor up rather than on the same floor, right? This is the same problem we have at ASU, where there's bathrooms, but the women's bathroom is on the 2nd floor, not the 1st floor. So when we talk about accessibility in spaces, we want to talk about how these spaces are accessible or not accessible now. And these are things you can think about when you're thinking about whether or not a space is accessible. The second is a sense of inclusion, right? Independence here is sort of the critical takeaway from a sense of inclusion. These are things like, don't make decisions for a disabled person without asking them. I thought this would help you without consulting you first, kind of things, right? I thought I would pick up your cane off the ground for you rather than asking you if you wanted me to pick it up off the ground. It takes away a sense of individuality and independence from a disabled person when somebody is always swooping in to help them, swooping in to make things better. Whereas for me, at least, I would prefer it if somebody asked. And I think that a lot of other people who I've talked to have also made these sort of similar comments to me. There are things like stares and questions. Questions like, what happens to you? Or, what's the problem? There's no problem. I'm disabled, but that's not a problem. I don't see it as a problem. I see it as something that I am, something that I move through the world with. One of the other things about sense of inclusion that I think is really important is accessible hotel rooms. I was talking with a director recently at an accessible hotel room at a tournament, and their team was right next door in another ADA room, although they didn't request it. It just so happened that way. And the director said to me, man, the shower in that room is so awesome. I think I'm going to start requesting accessible rooms. That is the wrong way to go about this, right? Because I need a bar in my shower in case I have a seizure. I need to be able to grab onto the bar in the shower. And if somebody else is swooping in and scooping up the accessible rooms before I have a chance to reserve one, then that is no longer accessible to me. It actually makes the debate space less accessible, right? And so when we talk about tournament directors getting hotel rooms, putting ADA rooms on the hotel blocks is really important. We have to request of every single hotel that we stay in that we be put in an ADA accessible room. Those rooms usually aren't on the hotel blocks already. So when we make that request, it again is a form of accommodation as opposed to accessibility. We have to take time out of our prep in order to make the debate space more accessible for ourselves, rather than the debate space being accessible for us from the get-go. So the third thing here that we want to talk about is equitable participation. One of the key things here is recruitment. Tournament directors, tournament staff, and directors of debate programs, are you recruiting disabled debaters? Are you looking to folks on the high school circuit who may have disabilities and who may want to debate in college? Are you thinking about scholarship opportunities? Do you know where scholarship opportunities are for disabled people? These are all things that you can think about in the context of creating a more accessible debate space for disabled debaters. It's not just that, but it's also the demands of competitive success. We're going to talk about this in just a minute here. For those of us who debate with disabilities, the demand for competitive success can be extremely exhausting. For those of you who know me, you know I have a neurological condition that causes seizures, and a 16-hour day is probably one of the worst possible things that I can do to myself. But I love this activity, and so I choose to do it. And this is why I think that regional debate is more accessible debate. I know that we are all at a national tournament, and that is a privilege and a responsibility that we all have to our community. But things like Augustana College and the folding programs in California that are not able to access these national tournaments, accessibility is an issue for them too. They may not be disabled in the traditional sense, but they are disabled by the debate space putting such an emphasis on the national tournament schedule. And that creates a level of inaccessibility for those programs. The regional debate is always a more accessible form of debate. Being able to drive to a tournament as opposed to having to fly means you can take more teams. Being able to go to tournaments that are local are usually cheaper tournaments that you can go to, which allow teams that have small budgets to be able to engage in the debate space on a regular basis rather than only having a couple of local tournaments. Dan and I have a praxis of going to our local tournaments, although not everyone in D1 does. We like to go to our local tournaments because we feel like the region is important. D1 is important to us. And so we like to make the debate space accessible by making sure that we are there at those regional tournaments, not only to bring back what we've learned on the national tournament circuit, but also to make sure that those tournaments make. This weekend, there's a tournament happening in Northern California, the Northern California Forensics Association tournament, that just barely made, and that's only because they collapsed novice, JV, and open together into, what was it, 11 teams? 9 teams. 9 teams. That's the tournament that's happening in Northern California this weekend. So many of the programs there have folded because they can't go nationally. Regional debate is the most accessible form of debate. And even if all of these things are covered, there will still be accessibility requests because every request is different. Every debater, every disability requires a different level of access. And so thinking about the ways that different disabilities affect different parts of your program is really important to be able to create accessibility for all. So a couple of things here, and then I'm going to pass it on to Eric Lanning. We're going to talk about some best practices. Some best practices for teammates, for coaches, for tournament directors. We already talked about this a little bit, but ask before you help someone. Ask before you make a move in order to assist someone. You might think you're doing a nice thing, but for me, it just feels like you're swooping in and trying to help. And I know that other people have expressed that to me as well. Many disabled people value independence, and that independence can be really important. For instance, when I'm in a wheelchair at the airport, because I use a wheelchair at the airport for mobility, I really like to be able to wheel myself around. Some of the wheelchairs have big wheels that I can wheel myself, which allows me mobility. But some of the wheelchairs that they have these days have press button levers on the back of them and don't have any wheels on the side that I can wheel. And that traps me into being stuck having somebody else have to move me around, right? And so independence is something that's really important. Another really important point here is that taking longer to do something does not necessarily mean an indication of needing help. So sometimes disabled people take longer to do stuff. I take longer to pack up my things. I take longer to walk through a lobby. Other people take longer to organize their thoughts before they can talk about pre-round prep. These are all things that are not indications of needing help. They're just indications of needing more time. That's something that we don't always have a lot of in the debate space, but we can definitely make sure that we are making the space accessible by allowing folks who need to take more time by not offering them help, or by saying, can I help you, as opposed to let me help you, right? Two different things. We talked about this a little bit earlier, avoiding questions of what's wrong with you or what happened. It's really rude and uncomfortable for everyone in the situation, and it makes it so that we feel like we're on display. We're a spectacle, a show, a story for you to tell. That's how I feel when people talk to me about it. And people who know me usually know what's going on in my world because we're friends and we've had those conversations. But for folks who just randomly ask me that question who I've never met before, it's really weird and uncomfortable for me. Couple other things. Don't use the disabled stall in the bathroom. Please. Unless there's only a disabled stall in the bathroom, pick another stall. Otherwise, you are making the space less accessible. I need the disabled stall because it's got handrails, and if I have a seizure, I need to be able to hold on to something. Other people need the disabled stall because they have a wheelchair, and they don't fit into one of the smaller stalls. Other people need the disabled stall for other reasons. Don't use the disabled stall unless it's something that you need or it's the only stall that's available to you. Another thing that's really important is the idea of inspiration porn. This is the idea that people are inspiring because they do things while disabled. So somebody is inspiring because they are able to climb a mountain, but they don't have any legs. I think it's pretty inspiring that they can climb a mountain, as opposed to whether or not they have legs while they're doing it. And when you use inspiration porn, it creates a spectacle out of a disabled person. Another thing, don't touch. This is really important, not only for people with physical disabilities, but people with mental disabilities too. I'm thinking of my neurodivergent folk who have personal space issues going on in their world, who don't feel comfortable with other people in their personal space. And so something as simple that might seem as casual to you as touching them on the arm might be really uncomfortable for them. Don't touch, it's not appropriate, and you should ask before you go about that. In addition to that, things like grabbing my cane and pretending it's a gun. Today in the airport, a guy grabbed my cane and decided it was a golf club and started pretending like he was putting. This is a guy who was helping me get through the airport on one of the electric carts. Those are things that are really bad. Some people use their cane for balance. I use mine for balance. I use mine to make sure that I don't fall over. And so when somebody else grabs it from me, especially without asking, and decides that it's a play toy for them, it becomes really demeaning and condescending to me as a person because it's a part of my personal space. Another thing that I hear a lot, although I haven't experienced this, is the pat on the head or the pat on the shoulder, the "it's okay, you're disabled, that's all right." These are really condescending things that people should not be doing, that definitely make the debate space less accessible, and just in general when you're outside in the world beyond this space. Another good best practice is to not assume or presume that you know what somebody can or cannot do. For instance, I like to rock climb. People think I can't rock climb because I have a disability. I love to rock climb. I use my arms to do it. I don't have to use my legs to do it. But when I post pictures of it on Facebook, people are like, "I didn't know you could rock climb. You must not be disabled." People who are disabled have the best judgment about what they can and can't do. Nobody else can make that decision for them. And also to remember that not all disabilities are physical. Many are invisible. And so Luke's going to be talking about that in just a few minutes. Last one here is one that really, really bothers me, which is, I don't even think of you as someone who's disabled. This is something that people have said to me, and they mean it in good faith, but it denies the structures that disable us in the first place. And it's like saying, what you want to say is, I think of you as a capable person despite your disability. But what it comes across as is, I don't even think of you as a woman, or I don't even think of you as black, or I don't even think of you as Asian. These are color blindness arguments, essentially, that do damage to the disabled body because they deny us our ability to talk about the structures that oppress us by saying, well, I don't even think of you that way. I don't even think that society disables you. It goes back to the medical model and the medicalization of disability. Specifically to tournament directors, we've got a section here on this. One of them is a problem that we had earlier in the season that we haven't had anymore, but about honoring room requests. A room request for a tournament is not just about wanting to be close to the food or wanting to have a cool room. It's about making sure that the space is accessible. If I'm in a room that's far enough away from the food that I can't get to the food, then somebody has to bring me food. Now somebody has to help me through my day, as opposed to me being able to do it myself. When I'm in a room that's so far away from the community that I can't get to people to hang out with between rounds, I miss a huge part of why we're all here, which is to hang out with each other and to make lifelong friends. So room requests are not just about being somewhere that's cool and central to the tournament. They're not about whining. They're about true accessibility in the debate space. Now, I know that we had this problem with Wake earlier in the season, and Len was super responsive when we started talking about it with him afterwards, and now has made huge changes to the way they're going to do Wake next year. They're going to create an ADA accessible room, a floor of rooms in that main building at Wake in order to make sure that those rooms are available to people who have disabilities. That is one way that we can make the debate space more accessible. It's certainly not the only one. At Fullerton, we did a quiet room. Those of you that were there got an opportunity to experience a quiet space away from the hubbub of a tournament life, a space to collect your thoughts, a space to be alone for 5 minutes when we're in a tournament space all weekend and it's very congested and very full of people, especially neurodivergent folk, have a problem being around that many people. It becomes disabling to them. And so to provide a quiet space at a tournament is something that allows for accessibility. Now, we heard commentary back that it wasn't used very much or that there was never anybody in there. That's kind of the point, is for it to be a space that's so quiet that folks have a chance to go in there and they don't have to deal with a bunch of people. To allow that space to be available for folks to take 5 minutes, to have their moment, to have whatever emotional reaction that they're having to what's going on in their world. Another thing that I think is really important is something we haven't talked a lot about yet, but things like scent-free standards. There are a lot of folks who have disabilities that affect the way that they move through the world because of the way that scents exist in the world, who have scent disorders that cause them to either have hives or have some sort of physical reaction to these scents. And we haven't talked about that a lot as a debate space, but it is an idea that we can move forward with to have less scented things in our debate space. I like to wear perfume just as much as the next person, but I think that allowing ourselves to make a space that is more accessible includes talking about these things, even though it doesn't affect me. I think that that's important. I know that Gabe wants to talk about, and I know we'll have a chance to talk about this in the Q&A, about a CETA policy that might be a more comprehensive policy to discuss disability in the debate space. I think that that's a vital conversation, and I'm really glad for Gabe's leadership to help make that happen through CETA in the next year or so. I'm definitely going to be working on that, and I invite folks to work on that with us. We are really vocal on Facebook. It's pretty easy to find us. Really vocal on Facebook. It's awesome. Okay, and the last thing that I'm going to talk about is about tournament changes, structural changes to the way that tournaments exist. You heard me say before that accessible debate is regional debate. That is really where the most accessibility for debate comes from, not just in tournaments being able to have schools from smaller programs, but also in being able to get to those tournaments. I know that at Los Rios, where I came from in Northern California, several years back, we had a student who was in a wheelchair and we couldn't travel them. And so they weren't able to get to tournaments because they couldn't get on an airplane. We couldn't get the approval to travel them through our administration. So to be able to travel folks in wheelchairs to smaller tournaments is an accessibility issue. To be able to travel folks who have a phobia of flying is a tournament accessibility issue. Regional debate makes for a more accessible debate space. In addition to that, the 8-round structure of tournaments is always necessarily disabling. It's disabling to all of us because every one of us on Sunday morning is going to be like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I have to be awake right now. Because sleep deprivation is disabling to all of us. It's not just disabling to me as somebody who has problems sleeping in the first place, but it's disabling to every one of you. And so as a long-term thought process for our community, I think that we should be talking about how to adjust tournaments to 6- and 7-round models that become more accessible, that allow for us to have a more healthy debate space that we are all able to engage in and still have our arguments and still have our heated rounds, but also be able to get sleep at the end of the night, be able to, be able to spend time with our friends in between rounds and things like that. And I think that in the debate between 6 and 8 rounds, I think that the 7-round compromise is a really good idea. Personally, I think that that's a really good idea, not only for accessibility, but also because it provides a clean break line, also because it allows doubles to happen on the second night, and it allows everyone to be able to go home earlier on the third day. So those are all of the things that I have to share with you today. I'm going to invite Eric Lanning up to talk about the debater's philosophy idea. Y'all are welcome.
Okay, I've allotted myself 5 minutes, and if you've ever seen me debate, you know that I will not cover anything in that time. So what I want to talk about is an experiment that was talked about on Facebook a little bit, and it's archived somewhere, and I'm going to publish it and write some thoughts that I've had about it. But the reason I want to talk about debater philosophy is because it's both specific, but it's also a generalizable principle that we can use moving forward to talk about access in some of these conversations. And for me, when I was thinking about it, it raised some fundamental questions that I think we should be asking at every step of the way. And for every one of these experiments, every time we create access, every time we do that material thing, we should be doing it with a particular mindset. It has to be an open-ended process. We can't say, oh, we did access, now it's done. A CETA amendment was passed, yes, good. It has to be an ongoing sort of interrogation of what is up for debate and debate. And this is how I've been thinking about it. If there was someone that said that I want more speech time, I get more test time when I take a test at school, that's a thing, and no one calls it cheating, no one says it's unfair, is that something that the community would do? I want to ask a general question to other people that I would love for you to answer both in the Q&A and just in general, but what are we willing to do to change the format of debate to make it particular for a person so that they can debate? And I think that that asks some fundamental questions of why we're here and what we get out of it. What are the types of students that need debate the most? I think the advocacy skills that debate offers and has been recently displayed by student leadership, like huge shout out to Sarah Beth, like everything that has been happening has been really, really powerful. Like my heart is palpitating right now. It is awesome as a disabled person to see this type of advocacy happening and to see a community of people that I care about caring about things that I care about. So I think that that is just powerful, and I really appreciate that. But debater philosophy asks the question, is there something that makes you different from the cookie cutter neutral that we bring into a debate? And we do this with judges already, which I think is really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about the role of the judge and the role of the debater. We have these philosophies for the judges that tell us all these things they do and don't like, all these things they want to see in debates, all the things that they want out of debate. But there's nothing on the other side where debaters step up and say, this is what I bring to debate. None of us come to debate from the same place. And I think that is the thing about debater philosophy that made me start thinking, if you, before the debate, had a way to tell someone, here are my triggers, here's some background that I bring to the debate that I think you should know, and it was institutionalized in a way that it wasn't just before it. And this is what made me think about it, is we had an ad hoc debate with Indiana where they asked us before the debate, do you mind slowing down? And we were like, of course. Great, let's slow down. And I was surprised, shocked, appalled, all the verbs, bad, to hear that someone would say no to that question in this community, that some people sitting in this room might contemplate a different answer to that question. That's the type of thing that I think would be communicated in a debater philosophy. And I think if there was a norm of people reading these and thinking about it, thinking about the personal experience that people bring to this debate, that would be powerful. That would be a way to do access in an individual moment that would be particular. It would be an actual change you would do in that room, but it would also bring the right mindset to the answer, the question, which I think is the most important part. And that's why I like this idea. There's some stuff that I think needs to be figured out about it, whether it would be an opt-in or opt-out system, whether or not it would be public. I think there are some things that people feel comfortable disclosing. I do not mind talking about being an alcoholic, which is an invisible disability that I carry in this space. And debate, by the way, not a very great space for alcoholics. That's like, I think, part of this conversation. I think the healthy debater part of that was above, but that's also something that's not written on me. You don't look at me and think that when you walk up to me and say, hey, do you want a drink for winning this thing? That's the type of thing that I think if we stop assuming that debaters walk into this space with particular abilities and particular things, conceptions of the world, that if we can destabilize that, and if we can get the judge especially, but also the opponents, also the other coaches, all of the people in the room thinking about that person and what they need out of debate, that could be really powerful. Because debate is one of the greatest things that there is. I think the reason that all of us show up here, all of us do this, is because there's something powerful about it. And I think that if we could democratize the students that get something out of that, if we could say, hey, debate could be this amazing thing for students that aren't even here yet, if we could encourage tournament directors to make sure that they reflect in their policies an environment that invites these people. What if we were accessible before the people that need access showed up? That would be a powerful statement for debate today. What if we thought about this before? And I think that's debater philosophy is something that does that. It puts the onus on the individual person in the room. It says, what do you bring to this space? Not how do you want the debate to be, what arguments are allowable or not allowable, but are there things that need to be said before the debate about you? Are there things that you need for the debate to be accessible? So I think that there's some interesting questions. I would also ask everyone in the room this question, what would your debater philosophy say? And I think that it's not just applicable to disabilities. I think that it could be a blueprint for a wider conversation about why we debate and who should debate. And that was my thought about that.
I'm Luke Floyd. I debated Georgia State. Some of y'all know me, some of y'all don't. Some fresh faces. I'd like to give another thing to Sarah Beth, because if this proves that framework is wrong, advocacy skills go to all those kinds of different styles of debate. One thing that's been sort of a theme throughout this entire presentation has been a focus on other people. Unfortunately, ableism, like many other ideologies in the world, doesn't only happen in these glaring instances, like, for example, when someone takes your cane and uses it as a golf putter, or someone says something horribly offensive to you. It also happens through these instances where you just don't notice that you do something. And that's because when we have questions, when we have discussions of privilege, like, for example, with both with class and race, sex privilege, when we think about this, a lot of times our perception of these questions are turned inward on ourselves. How am I privileged? What can I do to change this? But with ableism, it's deconstructing ableism, it's exactly the opposite. Instead of looking at ourselves and saying, how am I privileged or able-bodied, we think about the accessibility needs that other people might have and how we can serve those. So with that in mind, I think that that's one thing you can take away, at least sort of philosophically, to give you something to chew on for thought, is instead of focusing inward and saying, thinking about yourself, you can focus on what other people might need. Specifically, though there's difference in perception between physical and mental ability, kind of like what Eric hinted at. Sometimes it's not visible, and sometimes you can't perceive that we have the things that we do. Being a veteran myself, I served in Iraq in 2011. I have both PTSD, and I also deal with problems, back problems, and tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears. And so a lot of times people can't see these. For example, we've been in rounds where people have been playing music, incredibly loud, and I'm all about playing music, getting pumped up. And then we ask people to turn their music down, and if you just looked at me, you would be able to tell that I have a hearing problem. So thinking about, why is this person asking me to turn the music down? Is it because they're trying to please me, or is it maybe they have a problem? And having those conversations, or at least the internal conversation, is good. So I don't want this to be, I don't want you to take away that this is about like do's and don'ts, or some sort of checklist you can mark off, because clearly this is not good. It's about reorienting ourselves towards consideration. I think that's one of the fundamental properties of accessibility, is consideration of others, and once again, this outward perspective. So one good thing that was sort of hinted at in Eric's as well is trigger warnings. This is a good example of something that is hidden, so you might not necessarily think about it, because someone doesn't walk in with a cane. There's not a list of things that we're given, like a debate or philosophy beforehand. Hopefully that'll culminate soon. But one thing is to be aware of is trigger warnings. I started off this year, for those of you who don't know what I do, I talk about my own experience as a veteran in terms of how it relates to war, my experience of war, and then the way that our community discusses war, and then juxtapose those two. At the beginning of the year, I was using very graphic narratives about my experiences, IED blasts, mortars landing, things like that. And then I just kind of stopped for a second before one round, and I realized that I didn't think about other people. I was only thinking about myself. I didn't think about, what if there's someone else that doesn't feel comfortable identifying as a veteran, that it was a veteran and went through those things, and I somehow traumatized them with my narrative without putting a trigger warning in there. So as a result, we started giving every one of our speech talks, at the top of it says trigger warning. I have all these different kinds of parts of my narrative that could be somehow triggering for you. This is an example of a consideration you can give someone. If you think there's a possibility that someone could, be concerned or be upset or hurt, it goes beyond hurt feelings, just physically hurt, re-traumatized, it's something you should do. One common concern I hear about this is if we give a trigger warning for one thing, we have to give it for everything, and then we're just treating everyone like victims. But listen, trigger warnings isn't about treating people like victims, it's giving them the agency to do something about it. Because when you give somebody a trigger warning, you're saying that you're restoring the onus on them, so they can say, well, fuck this, I'm out. I don't want to be a part of this. Or they can say, I'm prepared for this, and prepare themselves and not be re-traumatized. So there's a few different parts of this I want to talk about. First of all, is best practices towards those with mental disabilities, specifically the veteran community, and then also tournament considerations. The best practices, we can start off with the differences. Like I said, there's a glaring difference. I don't want it to seem like I'm hijacking the conference to be about veterans, but specifically starting off with best practices for coaches. Returning veterans from both the Afghanistan and Iraq campaigns are a large number of our universities. And in fact, you probably sit in classrooms with people that have served. 1 in 4 has symptoms or diagnosed PTSD, and 1 in 7 has a service-connected physical disability. So I don't know how many of the people that you have involved yourself with, even as students around you that are veterans, but this is a large population that has significant disabilities. So I don't know how many of that are coming into our classrooms or trying to join debate, but it's something to be aware of both when you're recruiting and when you're engaging with your teammates and when you're setting up tournaments.
So I think there's some what you should have as a coach for expectations for recruiting both veterans and people with disabilities, or veterans with disabilities and other people with hidden disabilities. Some experience problems, since this is a forum on disability, that's who I'm focusing on. I don't want you to think I'm pigeonholing all veterans, though, as having the same sort of war experience that everybody comes back, with this messed up in the head or something. There's a few symptoms that you can look for that are pretty consistent for all people that have PTSD as well. First of all, combat trauma, or trauma in general especially, causes, one of them is numbness. One of the big symptoms is numbness. And this emanates itself in a few ways in people. First, obviously, sort of avoidance, and which ultimately culminates in suicide. Your veteran students and the other people with PTSD are twice as likely as their civilian counterparts to commit suicide. So that's something to be aware of if you have somebody that self-identifies as a veteran and they have combat trauma. Engage them. Make sure they stay involved and they feel like an active part of the community. Aside from dealing with any sort of trauma in the community, telling your story, feeling like you're at home. And that's really what our project is on. Feeling like you can share yourself with other people in your community is really what also part of accessibility is about, and helps you feel like you're worth something, really. Second of all, they're also more likely to die in a car accident because of reckless behavior. A lot of young soldiers will come back after they have experienced traumatic events, and it's sort of a high. Once a bomb's gone off near you, stuff just doesn't really rally you too much. So you hop on a motorcycle and go 120, right? Like that's sort of comparable, and so they're more likely to die in a car accident. However, PTSD generally can cause differences in moods. It can cause people to have mood swings, or perhaps something happened earlier in the day. Anytime I got a call or deal with the VA, I can tell you I'm having a rough day, right? So if anybody knows, like whenever I come into the team room or something, and I'm like, look, I went to the VA today, people know to just sort of back off, right, and give me some space. People aren't trying to, maybe they had a rough day. Maybe somebody dealt with something in their past that is particularly problematic for them. So don't just assume, wow, they're just being a jerk. Second, especially for coaches, what can you expect for productive output if your student is experiencing a few months stretch where they're having problems? You can consider maybe they're not being lazy, maybe they're not trying to avoid deadlines. Once again, this goes back to, instead of thinking about what you're missing as a coach and the productivity that your team's missing, thinking about engaging that person, what that person might be going through. Maybe they're not being as productive, they're not cutting as many cards because they find it hard to even get out of bed in the morning, or they find it like they're isolated from that community. And then also, some people have physical disabilities separate from the mental problems, especially veterans. For those of us that served in combat roles or were working, I guess, a lot, the gear is really heavy. I'd wear gear that was like 60 pounds, 8-10 hours a day. So I personally have back problems. A lot of people do. So if you're a judge, don't look down for somebody for sitting down, especially at the end of the day. Because I can tell you, like, I need a couple of ibuprofen by round 3 or round 4 to even make it through without crying, because my lower back is being compressed riding in trucks and stuff with all that gear on. So I get that, like, clarity is an issue, and you want them to be able to enunciate. That's true. But don't, like, knock off their speaker points just because they don't stand up. That seems pretty silly in light of this. So as both a coach and as a teammate, how can you facilitate discussions about hidden illness? First of all, stigma prevents open discussion. This is pretty obvious in the military, in schools, and with us. And it turns into, if people can't openly discuss, they turn to, a lot of times, in veterans cases anyway, substance addiction. So for example, in schools, people have a hard time fitting in, especially if they have some sort of trauma. Once again, feeling a part of your community is really important. So be open and honest with them if you are a coach or if you're a teammate. I mean, you don't want to ask these questions like Sarah Beth said. You don't want to come up to somebody and be like, what happened? But I'm pretty sure if you engage another human being in an open and honest way, eventually you'll establish a connection where that sort of story will come out in a meaningful manner. Second of all, do not tell a veteran that you understand what they're going through and then share a personal unrelated story. I had a buddy of mine tell me that he went out to a bar the other day, and this guy he was drinking with, he didn't really know him at the time. He was telling him about some of the stuff he did in Afghanistan, and he was like, yeah, man, I know what that's like, man. Like, it's like when you go deer hunting and you shoot a deer. Like, I know what that's like. Clearly, you don't have to understand what they're going through in order to give them some compassion. And obviously, don't ask if they killed anyone. It has to be said. And then also, just because people appear calm doesn't mean that they are. There's been rounds that I've been in where I've been personally triggered, and it's been really hard to continue speaking. And specifically when you are re-traumatized or triggered is the word we use for it, a lot of times you kind of go numb. Your brain just sort of starts to shut down. And that's sort of the opposite of what you would think. You hear these, especially perceptions of people with PTSD, specifically veterans in Hollywood, of people going berserk, right, and shooting everybody. Well, that's not always the case. Sometimes people just shut down. And so if somebody appears calm, don't assume that necessarily means that they are if something just happened. Because obviously that's a combat adaptation, right? You're trying to remain calm in the face of a traumatic event. Have a plan in place. Teammates, if you know your teammate has trauma, have a plan in place for what to do in rounds if they become traumatized. Does that mean the 1A may have to stand up and give the 2A AR? Does that mean maybe the 2A, I personally have something written out in my blocks that if I am not able, and traumatized somehow in the round and not able to give my 2A, I have something written out beforehand explaining that scenario so the 1A can get up there and give that story, right? Or continue on. So have a plan in place, and once again, this is considering acting and helping others as well. And then this should kind of be obvious, goes back to the medical model. Don't require your veterans or anyone with a disability to go through university administration for ADA registration and in order to get access. This is, like I said, any day I have to deal with a VA is a bad day. And the university administration in particular requires not only that you have a VA documents, like military documents like the DD-214, then you also got to get a diagnosis from the VA and all this. And that's just frankly stuff I don't want to share with an administration as well, like Georgia State, we'll put it that way. I forgot this to be last year. So some tournament considerations for directors. What can you do? Quiet rooms, quiet rooms, quiet rooms. These are awesome, I get it. Tournaments are, kind of, a lot of times it's hard to come up with rooms. But one extra room, even if it doesn't look like it's getting used, one extra room can mean all the world of difference. Knowing that someone has a place to go if they were to be traumatized means it makes all the difference in the world. And a lot of times it's not even necessarily someone has to be traumatized. Just personally, I don't have a great case of nerves, as they used to say, right? And so I find a lot of my teammates really annoying, frankly, as I'm sure all of y'all do too. But the difference is when I find my teammates annoying, it directly affects my ability to debate because I might start to shut off, right? So then, second of all, think about if you're a judge, recourse during rounds. A debater's traumatized. What are you going to do during rounds? If a debater starts crying, if a debater breaks down, what are you going to do? Think about how you might handle that situation. Think about, rather than asking them, what's the problem, rather than asking them, put the onus back on them. Do you need something? Can I help you with something? Do you need a minute? So that they can make a decision about what to do in the middle of the round. That's all I have. But basically, just once again, instead of thinking about your own privilege within an ableist society, thinking about what you can do to help others within an ableist society.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Luke. We're going to have our Q&A session now. We have, so will you get questions off the live stream and things like that?
I have the live stream pulled up here too.
Dan's got questions off the live stream. Dan's going to moderate the Q&A session for those of you who don't know. The fabulous Daniel Sanfield, my big partner.
So, and whoever wants to field these questions, there, that Luke, Eric.
Yeah, come on up here.
Hi, I'm Corey. I debate for Towson. I have epilepsy, and I know a few other Black women in the debate community who have disabilities that aren't in the room right now. What are you doing in terms of intersectional approaches as far as what we even see as disabled? Like a debater named Toby who has, a few issues, one of which is social anxiety. And she gets written off as being the stereotypical Black bitch, which is like she doesn't want to talk. She's being rude right now, when really she's just being herself and expressing herself. What does that look like? How do we accept her into our community? And what does it look like to be Black and disabled? Does that look like just icing on a cake, or does it look like an actual social position? How are we incorporating that and making them feel like they are welcome and that their feelings are being heard? Because, Kevin had to drag me here because I don't feel, like I'm a part of, I support the community, but I don't feel like I'm a part of it.
I would just say that I'm sorry that you don't always already feel like you're a part of it. I think that is on us, and that part of this is an attempt to say who's out there and to share these experiences. I've talked to Toby, and I think that is, I'm so glad that you would mention that, because I do think that it is striking that when I read about disability studies, I do not read about white people. I do not read about cisgender people. I read about people that live at the intersection of a lot of things that I'm not, and I think that this conversation has to be about those people, and I think that that is so important that we speak. I think that I certainly don't want to speak for anything that I'm not, and I think that asking the questions about access that we are asking is an important question to even making sure that those conversations begin in the first place. And I think that, I'm gonna add you to the Facebook group because I think that you have a perspective that I want to talk to you about this, and I'm sad that it would take a public meeting for this conversation to happen, and I think that these conversations are happening. It's not that they aren't happening. I think that I've talked to lots of different people about disability, and I think that part of this process is taking those conversations into the open and making sure that it happens in a transparent way, and that it happens in a way where all of the stakeholders who are involved, it's not just who we're talking to, it's everyone that's actually affected by it, making sure it's not an echo chamber and that we invite people to talk about their experiences.
And it's also not just us, right? We are being very vocal about this right now, but we have a very vocal Facebook group that we would like to add more people who exist at these intersections into this Facebook group and have these conversations. This is a new project, if you want to label it that. This is a new wave of folks talking about disability in the debate space, and it's the three of us were willing to talk about it, the four of us were willing to talk about it tonight, but this is only the beginning of that conversation, and I feel like that conversation needs to grow and include these voices as well.
I would also add, just like Sarah mentioned when she was originally talking, like we can only really have the ability to talk from like the experiences that we have as individuals. So like honestly, like I mean, looking at this panel, we can't possibly know what that intersection looks like, and like the types of needs that has, and I'm honestly at a loss for like how we start to think about how to create accessibility.
I'm going to take more responsibility. I think that my recent scholarship and what I've been reading has been informed by a desire to seek out those intersections in a way that maybe this meeting did not. Like I should have asked Toby if she wanted to participate. I should have asked more generally. I'm going to 100%, that's me. You know what I mean? I'm not going to write that off. There was something that I could have done about that, and so important, and like I'm very glad that you asked that question. I think that's a question I should have asked myself before, and yeah, those people need to be here. That this has to be a conversation that is not, it has to come from there too.
Isaiah and then Sierra.
I guess my question is, because like I'm all about results. That's kind of my thing, right? Like I like these kind of discussions to be cool at times, but if we can't ask all of these questions in the face of competition, because I think that that's something that was, we kind of addressed it, having access to the competition, but we're not like thinking about how does the competition reform a lot of the ethics, right, that come into, well, I don't think that's, like something that you might be cheating about, or I don't think that that should be, allowed around for you instead of everyone else, because those kind of concepts always come in the face of competition. And I know we are here to be educators, cool, but we can be real about how debate is not educationally centered, right? And so if that's true, then what does this mean? Like, and I know that's a huge question.
That's kind of like, honestly, I feel like that's the question I was asking too. Where's that boundary? Where does competition mean that we would say you can have more speech time, that we will talk slower, that we will make less arguments in the debate that we would normally do? We will make this change to the way that we do debate so that we can debate you. I think that answering that question, and I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know where the community would draw that line. And I think
I'm asking you all, where is that line? Like, where should that line begin drawn, because a lot of the times we don't start politics until a lot of people decide, hey, this is how it's going to happen, and that's what, and then we start to modify because there's something to agree upon. But if there's nothing that we can largely say, hey, here's the line. Like, we agree in every instance that this should not be violated. We agree in every instance that judges don't get to have a decision about how this had, but they agree to be a part of the tournament rules, and as long as the tournament sanctions it, that's what you're supposed to do. Right? Like, a lot of those kinds, because we know we'd be in spaces where judges say, All right, I remember my freshman year and I couldn't read because out of my left eye I'm legally blind. And the judge was like, no. I had all of these problems. It's a humongous like magnifying glass over everything I read. Right? And because I kept hearing that round after round, like I remember. And I went to the tournament, people were like, look, that's not an issue. Right? And I was like, that's not an issue? Right? And then people started to see why and how that issue became a thing where I just memorized my 1ACs because I couldn't read it verbatim off the paper anymore. because either debaters were snatching them over my shoulders. You know what I'm saying? You know how that used to go when we all used to go paper. But I'm saying that like those things are still real, and when we talk about access, it has to be a culture of access. It just can't be, all right, look, this year we're talking about war, so it's cool to talk about that in the context of everything. So we throw in veterans and that we act like we care, right? Like we know the debate community is only 4 years older every time.
I think it's interesting that you're looking this direction, but you're talking to people that bring disability everywhere that we go. This is not like we're talking.
Sure.
You're
And
talking
all
to
of
a
us
group of
read
people.
these issues in debate rounds and bring them up as
I
part of
agree with you.
our
It
arguments.
can't just be this, and
Yeah.
it has to be an ongoing process, and it can never be this is the list of access and we did it. That's not
A good example is actually when Sarah Beth started the charge also to take out the section 6 of the anti-harassment policy. They just footnoted accessibility because that would have been enough. They would have said, I'm sure a lot of the tournament administrators would have said, well, we have a policy. That's it. When this requires a
people
completely
already
separate
we
issue.
have a policy.
It requires a completely separate discussion, and yeah, it starts here. You're right. This is this the first forum we've had on this?
It's the first forum in recent memory. There were issues of ableism that were discussed previously in the debate community in the 80s and 90s, but there hasn't been a plethora of them recently. This is really the first.
Just also to answer something that you said, access is not a policy, it's a conversation that we have with a bunch of people, and it goes on and on and on. And I've had so many conversations with people in debate that make me think that this is worth having, and that this room is obviously not going to fix everything. And I'd like the results. I wish that it could. I wish there was something that we could do immediately that would result it. But I think it's more about starting a conversation with a series of people, with stakeholders that will answer back, that will answer some of these questions that we're asking. And I think that's more important.
Sierra, and then I saw the hand in the back. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
All right, mine was pretty simple because I heard you mention our Facebook group about, and what is it called for one? Because I've never really heard of it.
Sure.
And also, since you are talking about invisible disabilities, are you, when you're seeking members of this group, are you just seeking members who are visibly disabled or people who, like, 'cause obviously, how do you make that group accessible to people?
Sure.
I think anyone in the group would attempt to define disability in a way that would
But how
That
do
would
they even
include
know about that group is what I'm saying.
So the group is pretty new, right? It's all come out of sort of when these arguments started being read at Wake, and then over the swings, over the.
I'm just saying, how come you don't have it posted right there on the board for
Oh,
people
well,
to know what it is? You know,
So that's a good
people
idea.
can
It's
join
called
the
Students for an Accessible Debate Space,
group.
and I'll post it on the board. I'll also post it on the College Policy Debate Forum
Okay.
after this meeting tonight, so that folks can have access to it. We have been adding Zach Richter's debate Facebook
Right.
group, right? We've been adding people to it as people have come to us to talk to us about these issues. We haven't posted it widely yet.
So this is on us for not
yeah.
reaching out to more people. That's
Okay.
absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that this is the beginning of a conversation. We are not pretending
Yeah.
that everything that's happened is like
Yeah,
we
so,
did it.
so,
Like
yeah.
I think that
This
the
is
questions
the
that have been asked have
Yeah,
been very
this is the
important.
call. This is the beginning, right? This
I'm
is
saying,
How do we do this
for
better
us,
is
it's
the
like
question
this
that
is
we
the
are
call
asking each
for
other. I would love for
everyone
people
who's
to
not
answer.
initially in the circle, where like, you're having this discussion, some people can reach out, but I think that this is the call for folks who like, hey, I would be down if I know about it, but I don't know about that, put us on.
Right. So let's get more people involved in this conversation, and I think that is ultimately better for all of us because it's not just visible disabilities. I have invisible disabilities that you can't see by looking at me as well. Luke talked about some of his. Lanny talked about some of his as well. These are things that affect all of us. So yeah, we
It's
should.
also a lived experience that we share, and talking about it makes me feel good. And like that is honestly one thing that really. The biggest thing that I've taken away from this is a sense of community that I've started to feel developing, and it's the beginning, and there's incomplete parts of it because I haven't reached out to the right people yet, and that's on
And
me.
we even talked about this at Wake. We were like at Wake standing around talking about how we wanted to have a sense of community and just the small amount of changes.
It makes you feel not alone in a way that can be powerful.
Yeah, definitely. All right, it's Joe.
Joe.
Hey, this is not a question. Forgive me. But I did want to just say one thing, because I think this is important to think about as we talk about all this stuff. I think that one of the weird things about debate is that so many of us act in different roles, especially those of us who are older. And, we do different things. Sometimes we're judges, sometimes we're coaches, sometimes, I'm a tournament director. Sometimes we work on different committees, and, sometimes we're just friends hanging out. And so I think what's important to remember is that debate is always kind of two things, right? It's always the moment that you're in the round. So we're always making debate. We're always making the culture of debate, right? So there's always that moment in the round when things are happening when you can make the culture of debate now. right? But there's also a long culture of debate, and I guess that's, I agree with you that like competition matters, right? You have to like that is a thing that matters. But there's also, I'm old enough to know that there is a, debate is older than 4 years. There's this long culture of debate that happens, right? And things that happen now are influenced by stuff that happened a long, long time ago. In fact, sometimes before y'all were born. That these norms come from things that are totally irrelevant to what's happening today. And that's sometimes why this inertia happens, and you're like, why can't we get things to change? And I think that's why you have to fight, and you have to like work at the level of all the different things we do, right? So what I want to say is all of the different roles that we play need to be engaged in this conversation. And so like one of the things I do is I'm a tournament director. I want to know all the different things I can do to make my tournament better. And just sitting here, I've learned a couple of things that I can think of to do. I want to know as a judge all the things that I can do. I want to know as a coach all the things I can do. And then there are, they don't let me make any really important decisions. So I'm not on those groups, but there are people who are part of those groups who I think have their hearts in exactly the right place and do want to know. So like when we reach out to the NDT board on this particular issue, they respond, right? And so as many of those roles as we can engage, the better off we are, and the more we are working at the culture, which is not one thing, but many things, and is being created at many different levels.
I think this is what Luke is talking about when he's talking about not the looking inward for internalized ableism, but looking outward in the ways in which we can all create a more accessible space, not just those of us that have disabilities, but those of us that are in the variety of different roles. And I think that goes back to sort of what Iggy and Corey and Sierra are all talking about not just making the space accessible, but making the conversations we're having accessible as well. Right? I saw a hand back in the far back there, and then Ryan.
I'm Skippy from the University of Texas at San Antonio. I've been around the activity for a while.
Skip, can you speak up slightly for me?
I've been around the activity for a long time. Probably too long for some people. But the thing about the hidden disabilities, I'm really glad that you're talking about. Because in the 30 some odd years that I've been in the activity, I had a hidden disability, which was ulcerative colitis that resulted in lots of operations and a coma and all kinds of stuff, and having my colon taken out. And I have a bag. Now, in my classrooms, I handle that by saying to people in the front row, you're going to hear some gurgles. If they offend you, move to the back of the class. But my bag's going to talk to you. That will open some dialogue sometimes for me with some of the students. But that's not where I want to stop with that. I want to talk about there are a lot of other disabilities that come with this, and they've affected me over the years. And I found a really unsympathetic response in the community. And that would be specifically, I can't hear well, I can't breathe well, I sometimes have to leave debate grounds. I love judging debate grounds, but I was no longer effective at it, and I had too great a respect for what you do to make a decision for you, and you would be surprised what I heard versus what you said. So what I discovered is that when I went to the NDT, I was told that the committee is talking about you. You're not doing enough. You need to give back to the community. And I said, they said, well, you should be judging. I said, well, I have got a lot of reasons I can't judge anymore. That you should be doing more. You should be doing things. And I said, well, I'm doing actually the most I can possibly do right now. I travel with my teams. I work with them. I run the program, and I fight for them, and I fight for money to help them debate. And I watch a lot of debaters, and I talk to a lot of debaters after rounds. I'm trying to be a positive force in the community. No, you need to do more institutionally. So I went to the NDT the next year, and they had me moving around saying, 5 minutes. Okay, Kyle, just be roll. Sorry, Kate. But even then I had to quit because I had to go to my room. So I don't go to the NDT anymore. My students do. I don't go to district. I don't go to the NDT national tournament. I've had a better reception out of CETA. And I think that anything that we do here, I'm begging you, as the people in this room who are both coaches and students and directors, do something here to make this organization, all these organizations work together on this process. And I think you need more than an hour to do it. I think you need a strong conference on it. I think you need a lot of support in what's going on. I just want to volunteer everything I can give to it, because I walked into the bathroom the other day at UTSA, and there was a long strip of toilet paper hanging over the back of the door where the hinge was. And there was a long strip of toilet paper hanging over the door where the opener is. And I went, somebody must have needed to kind of get access to these things. And I sat down and I thought, no, there's another person who has an ostomy here. And this is the only way that person can get any privacy and is really, really nervous about having this. And, I've had people tell me you shouldn't be using that disability stall. And I just say, well, we all have disabilities of some sort. Mine happens to be hidden. So, yeah, I think that we've got to open this up. And I applaud you for what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. I think that those are really salient details as we move forward. This conversation cannot be an ending point. This cannot be the stopping point for our discussions about this. This must be the beginning point for us to talk about these issues, not just this year, not just this season, but as we go forward as a community. Obviously, our community is in a lot of different states of shifting and changing at this moment. And I think that as we do that, there's an opportunity that is right for more accessibility that we create not just disabled bodies, but also the types of critical arguments that a lot of us like to read. Ryan.
Hi.
Hey, what's up? Hey, what's up? The champ is in the house. The champ is in the house.
I would like to call competition matters the most. In this activity, and I think a lot of the reason why we try to talk about. So my question revolves around trigger points. I know as a debater and coaching debaters and being debaters who use experience as a way not only to navigate the discussions that we have, but also to navigate their daily lives. To what degree do trigger points become an effective model for them if they're this one that allows them to have a cathartic process just about revealing those personal experiences? But what does that do? What does that do? I guess the secondary part of that question is I've seen these several times where just like that makes me uncomfortable, so I opt out, which means that we don't get the type of discussions that are necessary. So is there a point where triggers become good, or how do we come check when people are trying to opt out for their strategic not being forced to not even being forced, but even have a way to the oppression that they put on others or even experience themselves. Also, is there a point where we have triggers in this?
Well, I mean, triggers already exist. It's about lit. In saying here's a trigger warning, I'm not going to do what I'm about to do. It's to establish the onus for that person to be first of all ready for, and second of all to have a choice to say either I'm going to engage by opening up conversation of why you shouldn't. But to actually engage in voice. The conversation
is valuable, and I think making it a trigger warning, but then proceed. I mean, that's exactly that. People should not be able to avoid uncomfortable conversations.
This happened to me personally during Texas. A student actually broke down and cried because I shared he had an experience particularly that sort of repressed and didn't want to think about. And to me, it was like I felt that he had to go through this. Because I know what that's like. But at the same time, I don't want that to stop my own. Like you said, we need those things to happen. So I think that including trigger warnings as we did in those rounds. But second of all, sometimes tough discussions, and that is when it happens. That's why it's important for coaches and teammates to have a policy in place to know how to treat each other when things like that. So this conversation can continue and doesn't just shut down because someone's crying or someone gets upset or says they're upset. Right.
I want to make sure there's no questions from live stream. It is 9:02, and so are there any questions from the live stream?
There are a couple. They're kind of broad, but
For those of you that have to leave,
good.
hang on. For those of you that have to leave, thank you, really appreciate it. We'll see all of you tomorrow. Thank you for coming.
Essentially, how far are we willing to push accessibility?
Sure.
What about design,
So these are questions that will need more discussion. I think that interpreters debates is not enough. Right? And you had an idea that Chris Hall brought up this important. Yeah. For those of you that are going to have conversation, kindly step out of the room for those of us who are talking about this. Muchas gracias, thank you very much.
One thing we can do also to just have a place for these kind of questions. That's maybe not even website, maybe a site.
Yeah, I think that's probably the next level of this.
Right now it's access.com, that's our site.
Sure. Hey, thank you very much. Appreciate your comment. Definitely.
We got Trump.
Eric, you owe me cigarettes.
Yes.
It's good to find
Yes.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for live streaming. And
there's a lot of tweets.
Excellent.
I'm gonna shut it down right now though, I think.
I just wanted to say, I have one.
Yeah, when I